Question number two is why don't we buy sheet music like people used to do? Why don't we go out and buy, sheet music of the latest Adele song or Justin Bieber song, whatever it might be? Well, there's a very long and complicated history behind this, and I can only begin to sketch it in for you today. The short answer is that it's because of recordings and broadcasting, radio and television, and those made the performance of the song more important than the actual written, notated song itself. Recordings start to increase in sales just after World War I in the late 19 teens, and they rise up, and then radio comes in, and the recording sales go down because everybody bought a radio instead of buying recordings, and then they started electrical microphone recording, and then sales begin to go up again, but then the Great Depression comes, nobody has any money, so they go down again, and finally at the beginning of World War II they start to go up again. Basically it's been uphill ever since, although as we know, many of you will know, is that the recording industry is now in a lot of trouble because of streaming, which is not as profitable as hard copy sales. Well, the other thing that happens with this popularity of radio and particularly recordings is that the production of the music, the arrangement and the sound, the use of resonance and different layered effects of sound technology becomes more important than the actual basic structure of the song and words themselves. This tendency begins with the work of a brilliant guitarist named Lester Paul, and his wife Mary Ford, but also particularly Les Paul, who's still idolized. If you're a guitarist, you probably know Les Paul because he's like this, foundational electric guitar technician and musician. And in about 1948-49, he began to work with layering music in a way that became known as the sound, and this sense of the manipulated sound in a recording became increasing throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. By the mid-1960s, in a sense, the producer's job is more important than the performer's job or the songwriter's job. It's those sonic effects that become more important than the song structure itself. And that's a great generalization. Of course, there's a huge span of practices going on all at the same time, but this is one of the phenomenon of the era that we have to think about in terms of the history. The other factor that goes along with all of this is that in the first half of the 20th century, popular music in the urban centers was basically a piano-based music, a keyboard-based music, and you had the potential for this wide variety of harmonic structures that really could draw from the classical music tradition of the Western societies, which are the most dependent on and, in a sense, developed in terms of their harmonic aspects. Starting with the rock and roll revolution in 1955, popular music becomes more guitar-based. There always had been use of guitars, banjos, ukuleles, and so on, and you often will see in the old sheet music the guitar or ukulele chords above the piano staves. But it was always a secondary thing. And now composition itself becomes done more on the guitar. It becomes even more predominantly than it had been before a music based on the blues, which you traditionally, well, in its most distilled form, only uses 3 chords. And so from 1955 onwards, that's the other trend that tends to decrease the sheet music sales and increase the dependence on the recording. Because if you're only using the 3 blues chords on your guitar, basically you often can figure things out just through hearing much more easily. You don't have to look at notated music. You also can do compositions more easily without having to make notes about the complex chord structures that you're creating. Again, this is a great exaggeration and a generalization over generalization. There's, again, a huge span of practices within any one era and throughout the whole tradition. But those are some of the factors that are involved with why we no longer are collecting sheet music. The pivotal year was between 1956 and 1957. In 1956, in America, you still could go to your local, newspaper magazine seller, and there would be sheet music there. You go to your local supermarket and grocery store, and there'd be racks of sheet music there in the store. After 1956, they disappeared. In 1957, they just disappeared. So that was sort of the pivotal year when the change consolidated, crystallized. It didn't start then. It just sort of finally crystallized.